Critical theory springs from many sources, but one of its main roots comes from the ideas of social theorist Karl Marx. Critical theory adopts Karl Marx's view of justice, and which Marx redefined justice as something very different from how the Bible defines justice. So my intent today is to explain Karl Marx's view of justice and then explain how critical theory adopts his view of justice, but it adds a few modifications to it along the way. So it's not 100% Karl Marx's view of justice, but it's very influential over what is going on today. So we'll first talk about Marxism 1.0. Classical Marxism divides all of humanity into two basic categories. You're either an evil oppressor or you're one of the innocent oppressed. One of those two. This is called the social binary. Binary meaning two. The social binary. So, if Marx is right, each person in this room is either an evil oppressor or one of the innocent oppressed, if Marx is right. So this is how classical Marxism defines the groups. The oppressor would be landowners, owners of the means of production, so factory owners, and then employers in general, those who employ others. The oppressed would be renters, factory workers, and other types of employees. Those are the oppressed. So according to Marx, oppressors create and sustain social, legal, and political conditions which enable them to control the lion's share of the wealth and resources in a society. Oppressors find themselves in a, quote, privileged position. They inherit advantages that they did nothing to deserve or earn, but are theirs simply because they are born into the ruling class. So that's the state of oppressors. The oppressed, on the other hand, find themselves in the inescapable condition of poverty and social abuse. So that's where the oppressed find themselves, according to Marx. The oppressed victims are morally innocent. The oppressors are morally guilty. Innocence or guilt is determined by which of the two groups you belong to. Innocence or guilt is determined by which of the two groups you belong to. Your personal guilt or innocence are not determined by your individual actions. And this is very, very important to understand. Your guilt or innocence is not determined by your individual actions. According to Marx, sin and guilt are seen as collective rather than personal and individual. So, the God, small g, the small g God of Marxism asks you one question at the judgment seat. Are you in the oppressed identity group or are you in the oppressor identity group? So according to Marx, the only way to bring justice, and this is the difference between Marx and the Bible, about their view of justice. The only way to bring justice to a society is through the unification of the oppressed against the ruling class oppressors by way of violent revolution. So justice, according to Marx, is the stripping away of the wealth, political power, and privilege from the oppressor class and giving it to the oppressed class by whatever means necessary. So this is the very heart of Marxist justice. This is the very heart of Marxist justice. Before the Bolshevik revolution in justice, which was a Marxist revolution, you may have been a landowner who was kind, reasonable, and generous to your renters. You may have been a factory owner that paid your employees on time and for what they were worth. But according to Marxist identity politics, you were seen as guilty and worthy of death or imprisonment simply because of your group identification, not because of your individual guilt or innocence. Martin Latsis was the chief of the Ukrainian secret police, and he was responsible for carrying out the murderous Red Terror during the Russian Revolution. He said it this way: "We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not look in the file for incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs. What is his background, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused." That is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror. Leviticus 19:15, "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." So you can see the very heart of Marxist justice is partiality, a sin that God hates. It's partiality, a sin that God hates. Friedrich Hayek puts it this way: the idea of social justice is that the state should treat different people unequally in order to make them equal. Should treat them unequally in order to make them equal. So classical Marxist justice limits its focus to economic inequality between classes. So just finances, essentially. The two identity groups, the oppressed and the oppressor, are defined simply and only by looking at economic differences between people. That's what classical Marxism, that's how it defines the two classes. Classical Marxism has been tried multiple times in the 20th century with the result of rampant poverty and the death, imprisonment, and oppression of hundreds of millions of people. Despite all this, despite its failure, Marxism is still with us. Though it has rebranded itself, Marx's deadly theory is still the most influential worldview in the West today. And here is why I say this. Here's why I say this. A new generation of Marxists has arisen to reboot the movement. A new generation of Marxists has arisen to reboot the movement. This new version has been incubating in our universities in the USA and in Europe under the broad heading of critical social theory. It has been in our universities for decades, and it has now gone completely mainstream. It is all around us. It's not just in the universities anymore. In general, what's in our universities is about 20 years ahead of what becomes mainstream in our culture. And that's what has happened. So the following slides are taken, go ahead and go to the next slide. The following slides are taken from two different textbooks that are used extensively in colleges of education. And these are just two. If you look at almost any college textbook that is used to train our teachers, it will have something like this in there. These are being used to train our public school teachers. These teachers, in turn, are teaching our children. The blue box contains a list of oppressor groups, and the red box contains a list of those that they oppress. So you can see that, that white people are oppressors of Asian, Black, Latino, and Native people. Biological men oppress biological women. Gender-conforming biological men and women, I have it here, they oppress transgender, genderqueer, intersex people. Heterosexual people oppress lesbians and gay men. And you can see the rest there. But I'd like to point out in this one and in the next one that Protestant Christians are listed on almost every single one of these lists as an oppressor group. In almost every single list. So the next one, similar, another textbook. So, and you'll see that down there again that Christians are oppressors of all other religions, essentially. And I believe the idea that Christians are listed on both of these lists and in most other lists that you find like this, I believe that this is going to have consequences for followers of Christ in the next few years, sometime in the future in our country. What makes this even more complicated is that you can simultaneously be an oppressor and one of the oppressed at the same time. So your guilt or innocence can decrease or increase depending on how many of these different groups you belong to. So a white woman would be considered one of the oppressed because she is a woman, oppressed by men, while at the same time being an oppressor because she is white. You see that? This idea is called intersectionality. And I imagine that a lot of you have heard that word, but you may not know what it means. The more oppressor intersections you have in your life, the more guilty you are. The more guilt you have, the more you are part of those oppressor groups. The more, so a white, heterosexual Protestant male in the middle or upper class, for instance, would be highly guilty and would need to give up some of his privilege, wealth, and power for the sake of Marxist justice. A lesbian, black, Hindu would be innocent and considered worthy of some of the fruits of the redistribution of privilege, wealth, and power. This is the very heart of the idea of intersectionality. So with Marxism 2.0, the categories are different, but the end result is the same. The redistribution of wealth, power, and privilege from those labeled as oppressors to those labeled as the oppressed, based on the collective guilt of their assigned identity groups. So this is the natural outworking of critical theory. It's not just a theory, it has an activist component. So critical theory is not just a theory, it has an activist component. And that is the power of the state used to redistribute power, wealth, and resources. Voddie Baucham explains it in this way in 3 steps. Step 1 is to identify disadvantaged groups. It is not about the individual. Again, it's not about the individual. It is about identifying groups that have disparate outcomes or different outcomes from other groups. So after you identify who those groups are, step 2 is to assign blame for those disparate outcomes. The reason is that wealth, power, and resources, are seen as a zero-sum game. When I say zero-sum game, this is what I mean, is that if I personally don't have wealth, resources, or some other privilege, it is because someone else took it from me. Does that make sense? If I don't have privilege, wealth, or power, it's because someone else took it from me. That's what zero-sum politics means. Therefore, if somebody doesn't have those things, blame must be assigned to someone else. This step requires interpreting unequal outcomes as damning evidence of a racist or a sexist system. So let me say that again. This step requires interpreting unequal outcomes as damning evidence of a racist or sexist system. Ibram X. Kendi, a very well-known critical race theorist, puts it this way: racial discrimination is the sole cause of racial disparities in this country and in the world at large. So he believes that racial discrimination is the sole cause for any differences you see between races or ethnicities. If a particular group is having a negative outcome in a particular area, then we need to find out who's to blame for that. We need to find out who it is. So, if this group over here doesn't do as well academically, if this group doesn't do well economically, if this other group commits more crimes, if this group is in prison more, if this group is not as well represented politically, then we need to find out who is to blame. We need to find out who is to blame. Step 3 is that there needs to be a redistribution of power and resources to address those grievances between those who are deemed as disadvantaged and sent over to those who are deemed to be are taken from them and taken from those who are deemed to be to blame. So, according to critical theorists, to suggest that the reason for the disparity lies within the group itself is not allowed. That is not allowed. That is called victim blaming, according to critical theorists. We are not allowed to ask those kinds of questions. We are not allowed to ask those kinds of questions. There could be cultural or statistical reasons for these disparities, but we are not allowed to go there. We are not allowed to go there. The use, and this is very important, this is a feature of critical theory, not a bug. A feature, not a bug. The use of statistical analysis, objectivity, and diligent inquiry is seen as a smokescreen to propagate oppression. So to actually ask those questions, those kinds of questions, is seen as the oppressor class trying to hold on to power. According to critical theorists, the only answer is a redress of grievances. The trouble with this is that there are disparities. There have always been disparities, and there always will be disparities between different types of groups. And I don't have time to go into it today, but there are many examples of ethnic disparities that are clearly not the result of discrimination or oppression. And I can get those for you if you're interested at a later time. All of those who have wealth, resources, and privilege are assumed to have unjustly gained them, unless they are a member of one of the oppressed groups. Does that make sense? Anyone who has those things are assumed to unjustly gain them unless they are a member of one of the oppressed groups. So, if you are a white person who has acquired wealth, that is unjust. Again, we are talking about groups here, not about individuals. You, as an individual, may not have done anything unjust yourself. Does that make sense? You as an individual may not have done anything unjust yourself. You may have worked hard and with integrity to achieve the success that you have. But according to critical theory, the justness of how you got to a place of success has nothing to do with what you did personally to get there, but everything to do with what group you belong to. Does that make sense? Everything to do with what group you belong to. So you, as a straight white man, could have clawed your way out of generations of poverty to make something of yourself. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. You are the privileged one. And if you stand shoulder to shoulder with the son or daughter of Colin Powell, born into privilege and power, the answer is whatever they have, they deserve. And whatever you have, you got it unjustly, and it needs to be redistributed. So to rightly understand critical theory, you must see it for what it is, a comprehensive worldview. It is not just about redefining justice, though that is at the core. It touches everything. Epistemology, how do we know what is true? Identity, what is man at his core? Morality, how do we determine right and wrong? Authority, who or what should be believed? And some of the other areas up there on the screen. And there are those within Christianity who are trying to blend critical theory with the tenets of Christianity. And honestly, that is really the only reason why I am up here today. The world is going to do what the world does. But when the world tries to get into the church, it's a responsibility of the church to defend the flock against that. Neil Shenvi rightly says, I worry that too many people are trying to hold on to both Christianity and critical theory. That is not going to work in the long run. We'll constantly be forced to choose between them in terms of values, priorities, and ethics. As we absorb the assumptions of critical theory, we will find that they inevitably erode core biblical truths. So what I would like to do right now is to dig into the core worldview beliefs of critical theory and then contrast them with the biblical worldview. So we're going to take them a question at a time. So the first question is, what is the nature of man? It's a question of anthropology. According to critical theory, there is no universal shared human nature. Let me say that again. There is no universal shared human nature. There is no universal, quote, brotherhood of man that we all share. Human beings are creatures whose identity is wholly determined by their group affiliations, especially those based on race, sex, and different gender identities. These groups do not share a basic universal humanity. The Bible has something far different to say. Proverbs 22 verse 2 says, "The rich and the poor have a common bond. The Lord is the maker of them all." In Ephesians 6:9, "And masters, give up threatening, knowing that both their master," the ones you're threatening, "and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him." So not only is he, God, the maker of every man, he has infused every human being with his image. He has infused every human being with his image, and he is the master of us all, and we're all accountable to him. Another point is that even more radically, according to critical theory, there is no such thing as, quote, the individual. There is no such thing as the individual. As I stand up here and speak, I don't speak as the individual named Kelly Shoemaker. I speak as a white, heterosexual Protestant male. Nothing else matters. I can be discounted simply because of my group identity, not because of me. This denial of the individual has far-reaching implications. Your personal history, your life experiences, your choices, your deeply held beliefs ultimately do not matter. The only thing that matters in defining who you are as a human being are your group affiliations. This kind of thinking destroys individual freedom, it destroys human responsibility, and it destroys accountability. It is profoundly destructive and dehumanizing. It is profoundly destructive and dehumanizing. If critical theorists are right, then I am simply programmed to think certain things and to be a certain way because of my group identity. I am pre-programmed because of the color of my skin. By contrast, the Bible affirms the importance of every individual. It says that our individual choices matter. God holds us individually accountable for our own beliefs and actions. When you stand before the Lord in judgment, you will be standing alone. You will be standing alone. At the final judgment, our sin won't be excused because we were labeled as members of a victim or oppressed group. Nor will we be damned because of the sins of those who look like us. Nor will we be damned because of the sins of those who look like us. As image bearers of God, we have moral agency. And with our moral choices come responsibility and accountability to God. Critical theory denies all of this. So this is not only dehumanizing, it is deunifying. It is deunifying in the sense that it breaks people into social groups that can never come together. They can never come together because we don't share a common humanity. A few years back on a campus at Yale University, there was an angry confrontation between a professor and some of his students. At one point in the conversation, the professor said, quote, "So I have a vision of us as people, as human beings, that actually privileges our common humanity, that is interested not in what is different among us, but what is the same." In response, a black student moved in close to him, face to face, and said this. He said, "Look me right in the eye. Look at me. Your experience will never connect to mine. Your experience will never connect to mine." This student spoke from the assumption that race defines identity. The race defines identity. Because this professor was white, his experience will never connect to that of the black students. If this is true, there is no hope of any kind of reconciliation or even communication between social groups. The question I have is any kind of discussion even possible if there is no shared humanity? As Christians, we can agree with critical theory advocates on one point, and I think this is important, that human beings are shaped profoundly by groups. The Bible does acknowledge that. The Bible affirms that we are not merely individuals, but we are social beings that are made for relationships. So you remember what God said to Adam right before he created Eve? It's not good for a man to be alone. And that is still true. That is still true. Groups deeply shape who we are, very much. And this is why 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." They do shape us. But that being said, we as believers must forcefully deny that human identity can be reduced to group identity. We must forcefully deny that human identity can be reduced to group identity. The groups we belong to shape us, but they do not define us. The bedrock of human identity is found in our common creation. We are all created in God's image and likeness with equal value and dignity. God offers a gracious open door of redemption to all men if we will but take it. We are all rebels, but God has opened a way for all men to be saved. When we trust God through faith in Christ, we regain our true identity, which transcends all other group identities. Galatians 3:26 through 28 says this. It says, "For in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. But as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ." He is your identity. "There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." I don't think that any of us can fully imagine the dystopia that will result if we discard the Bible's view of human nature in favor of the dehumanizing, divisive idea that individuals don't exist and that people are reduced to mouthpieces or drones of the groups that define them. Critical theory can only divide because it has no basis for unity. It can only segregate us into competing tribes pitted against each other in an endless and often bloody power struggle. Second question, what is our fundamental problem as human beings? Critical theory answers this question with one word: oppression. One word: oppression. Instead of evil being present inside the human heart, evil is sourced outside of man. Evil is sourced outside of man, in society, and specifically in social structures and systems and institutions and laws and cultural norms that perpetuate inequalities and grant one group power and privileges at the expense of other groups. That is the zero-sum game. It's like there's a power and resources and wealth is just a limited pie. If somebody gets a big slice, then somebody else has to take a smaller slice. The view of our fundamental problem has a number of negative results for both those who are labeled as oppressors and for those who are labeled as oppressed. Negatives all around. Groups labeled as oppressors are dehumanized and treated as those who are in need of punishment. Ta-Nehisi Coates describes, a critical race theorist, describes that whiteness is an existential danger to the country and to the world. He also claims that whites have brought humanity to the edge of oblivion. Whites have brought humanity to the edge of oblivion. And I'd like to point out that Mr. Coates is no fringe intellectual. He is regularly praised by Barack Obama, and he is routinely referenced in mainstream publications. He's not a fringe guy, he's mainstream. And this is interesting. He is currently writing the script for the next Superman movie. Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing the next script for our next Superman movie that's coming from DC Comics. Ideologies that draw the good versus evil line between different groups are historically very dangerous. And you've all heard this. If one group is good and the other group is evil, it is very easy to dehumanize those who are considered to be in the evil group. So this has happened all over. This happened in Nazi Germany with the Jews being labeled as the evil group. And in communist nations with the capitalists and the landowners being labeled as the evil groups. This kind of thinking as well paved the way for the genocide in Rwanda when the Hutus killed as many as 1 million Tutsis in just 100 days. Former intelligence analyst Stella Morabito has this to say about this kind of thinking. Railing against an entire group of people ultimately means rejecting each and every individual in the supposed category, regardless of the personal experience or the human sufferings any one of them might have endured as an individual. That's a hideous effect, because it is that very balance that makes human relationships possible. Why should one person's immutable characteristic cancel out their entire experience as an individual human being? How is that not the essence of bigotry? How is that not prejudging and dehumanizing a person? So critical theory destroys civil, humane society, replacing it with hatred, division, tribalism, and violence. We are seeing this happening in our cities all over our country, this very same dynamic. Unless we wake up as a society to its dangers, critical theory will destroy us, and it will do so in the name of justice. So that's the negatives for those labeled as oppressed, no, as the oppressors. There are also negatives for those who are labeled as the oppressed. If I am labeled as one of the oppressed, my problems and sins are ultimately rooted in something outside of myself that I cannot control. There is nothing that I can do about them. There's nothing that I can do about them. This takes away human ambition. It takes away human initiative and also creativity. It takes away all those things from a human being to be labeled like that. It leaves them wallowing in sin, hopelessness, and despair. It leaves them wallowing in sin, hopelessness, and despair. Whenever we try to live outside of God's description of reality, problems will always multiply. Problems will always multiply. There are certain populations in our society right now who are told that oppression is their identity. Oppression is their identity, and that it is inescapable. Now, I want to make sure that all of you understand this, what this does to a person. In this sin-scarred world, there are terrible things that happen to people. There are terrible things that have happened to some of you. People can be victims of natural disasters, wars, violence, oppressive powers, or disease, and many are facing dire circumstances every single day as we speak. These people are victims without a doubt. They are victims without a doubt. But our view of them and their view of themselves should never be reduced to victim as an identity. Does that make sense? Like, they have been victimized, but their identity should never be reduced simply to that of a victim. The words victim or oppression describe a circumstance. The victim or oppression describe a circumstance, but they must never be reduced to an identity. Do you see the difference between you're in the circumstance of being victimized? It should never become your identity. People who are preaching oppression and victimhood as an identity fail to understand what this does to a human soul, especially to young people who do not yet have either the personal experience or the maturity to weigh these words against reality. And we can see this. We see a whole generation of these young people who are grouped into these oppressed categories. We see them behaving themselves as if the vision of the world that is presented to them is true. They are acting like they believe it. Why study and discipline yourself in preparation for the adult world if the deck is completely stacked against you? Why try if there is no hope? What a vision to present to young people. Can you imagine saying that to your own kids? Don't even try. You'll just fail. The world's stacked against you. It is insidious and it's evil. And as believers, we should have no part of it. When we diagnose the human condition incorrectly, when we say that oppression is our fundamental problem as human beings, there are real-world consequences in real people's lives. Human potential is crushed and lives are destroyed. And ultimately, it leads people to hell. Because when you are diagnosed with the wrong disease, you end up looking for the wrong cure. When you're diagnosed with the wrong disease, you end up looking for the wrong cure. According to the Bible, our fundamental problem as human beings can also be summed up in one word: rebellion. There are no groupings of human beings that are uniquely evil. Evil flows through every single human heart. Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Our fundamental problem is that every single one of us is in a state of open rebellion against our Creator. That is our problem. Romans 1:21 and then 28 through 31 says this: "For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind, to those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful." Paul couldn't be clearer. Our fundamental problem is that we refuse to honor God and that we refuse to give him our thanks. Those two things. We refuse to honor God and we refuse to give him our thanks. As a result, our foolish hearts get darkened. There is no one group who stands above this. Evil does not come from outside of us. It comes from inside of us. From inside of our hearts flows all manner of unrighteousness and evil. Nothing outside of us makes us hate God and hate our neighbor. Nothing. When there is oppression, it is not because of systems. When there is oppression, it is not because of systems. It is because of human hearts that do not see fit to acknowledge God or to give him thanks. Systems don't sin. Human hearts sin. Let me say that again. Systems don't sin. Human hearts sin. Where you do find corruption and partiality, you will find at the very bottom human hearts in rebellion to God, in rebellion against God. Alexander Solzhenitsyn sums this up perfectly. He says, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. So that's all I have. Next week we're going to answer the, we're going to answer the opposite question is not what is the problem, but what is the solution? And critical theory, the problem is oppression, so what is the solution? We're going to answer that next week. And the Bible is, our problem is rebellion. What is the solution to that? So two different answers to the solution as well. And then we're going to discuss what is our primary moral duty according to critical theory and according to the Bible. And then the third question we're going to cover next week is, how do we determine what is true? What does the Bible say? How do we determine what is true? And what does critical theory say? How do we determine what is true? So let me pray, and then I'll take questions. Lord, we see that these are very troubling times, and these are very deep waters to think through morally and intellectually. And Lord, I pray that we would be willing to expend the brain cells to truly understand this, such that that when we are confronted with lies, we know the truth. Help us to understand your truth. Help us to understand your law, to be experts in what your law has to say about reality, and experts in what you have to say about redemption and man's problem and all of these things. Lord, I just pray that you would make us even more people of the truth. Please help us to understand the reality that you explain in your word as the true reality that actually exists in our world today. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Oh, wow, shoot, I didn't realize the time was, but we could probably take just a couple questions. Yes. Hang on, grab the mic.
Okay. I've read material, and I'd like to get your reaction to how it fits into this. One problem I read about is black people who are excelling too well in education being pressured to tone it down a bit, and they in turn talk about how conforming to their culture means talking like uneducated people. How does that fit into what you're talking about? Yeah,
actually, I was going to talk about that as part of this talk, but it was one of the things that ended up on the chopping on the floor as I chopped stuff out. Yeah, but essentially, there in certain areas of our country, there are, like I said, populations of people that are told that they are oppressed. They shouldn't even try. And so culturally, the way that works out with the youth is what you said, is it's considered an act of racial betrayal to study and to do well in school. And it's considered an act of racial betrayal to speak with correct English in some ways. It's considered, all of those kinds of things. And often a student that decides that they want to make them something of themselves, they will face pressure and intimidation and sometimes violence for acting white. So they will face those kinds of things. And these are all the results of the people, of the, politicians, academics, telling them that they are oppressed and there's nothing they can do about it. One more.
Isn't it oppressive to tell someone not to succeed? To tell someone that, isn't that being an oppressor?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Hang on, let me see. Hang on just a second. Go ahead, Gary. Right here, Gary.
I don't need that. Well, it seems to me if we're going to listen to Marxism, and there is a book out that's been written, and it's advertised over Fox News, how America is becoming Marxist. If I was an oppressor what would be my way out? There's no hope. Okay, suicide. And we're thinking about young people, especially, who haven't established themselves. They're searching.
Right.
Okay, I'm hopeless.
Yeah.
Let's just take my life. That'll fix it.
Yes.
And I think that's why there's so many suicides lately. It's gone up terribly.
Absolutely.
They're flying out.
Okay, I'm going to do one more question. Right over here, Doreen.
The thing that's so hard to make sense of is the people that are pushing this are mostly rich white people. So aren't they going to lose what they have if they push this?
Yeah, well, what you see is within these socialist revolutions that they cry out for equality for the poor, and then they enact solutions to make that happen. But inevitably, you always see that the resources always go up, never down. The resources always go up. So a few become very, very wealthy, and the middle class disappears, and a majority of the country becomes embroiled in poverty. So, yeah. So anyhow, so. All right, let's go ahead and end, and then, yeah, you're dismissed. I guess I already prayed, so you're dismissed, yeah.